Hello, my name's Anna Cook and I'm a research fellow working part-time at Goldsmiths University of London and part-time at UCL Institute of Education in the UK. I'm a non-autistic mother of 2 autistic teenagers and an enthusiastic advocate for increasing understanding and reducing autism stigma in education. The research I wish to share with you today was conducted between 2016 and 2020, during and 1 year after completing my PhD at the University of Surrey. I wish to thank the funders who supported this research, Cube Learning and the National Autistic Society. So my doctoral thesis explored the impact of inclusion on autistic children, with a particular emphasis on bullying. Studies indicate that autistic children face many social challenges and are often stigmatised, partly thought to be due to differences in understanding of the social world, increasing their vulnerability to peer rejection and victimisation in mainstream school settings. As we know, this can lead to a number of serious long-term outcomes such as anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, school avoidance and higher likelihood of suicide. More specifically, research indicates high levels of bullying for autistic people. A bullying survey of 10,000 students in 2017 found that 75% of autistic young people reported having experienced bullying. And many of the characteristics that are considered to be the prime causative factors of bullying are often present for autistic children. For example, differences in communication and social behaviour and also social status. And these difficulties are likely to increase their exposure and vulnerability to bullying and social isolation. In the UK, 70% of autistic children are educated in mainstream school, and the authors Neil Humphrey and Sarah Lewis noted how a preference for routine, predictability and low sensory stimulation is at odds with the noisy, chaotic environment of mainstream schools. And whilst inclusion is the prevailing policy framework in the UK, many of its goals remain unmet, placing autistic children at even greater risk, and pointing to the need for greater focus on building understanding and acceptance of the notion of neurodiversity. So due to a scarcity of literature in this area, this study aimed to explore the impact of inclusion on attitudes towards bullying and autism. And in particular, it explores some factors that might promote change in attitudes. So the aim was therefore to explore the effect of inclusion and/or exposure to autism on the attitudes of non-autistic children in mainstream schools towards bullying and autism. So school climate and peer relationships are a key part of inclusion for autistic pupils. Studies using theories of social identity have found that identification with a group can influence reactions to bullying, moderate emotions, and that emotions can predict intended behaviours. It's important, therefore, to research attitudes and factors that can promote change in behaviour. So the opening of purpose-built specialist centres in 3 mainstream schools in the UK, one of which is pictured here, provided an opportunity to measure the impact of contrasting models of inclusion. The centre's planning and design were consistent with research on how physical environments can affect autistic people. While autistic pupils spend the majority of their lessons with their mainstream peers, the centres provide specialist support and a calm setting for autistic students to retreat to. So the first research question therefore explored the effect of school type, so comparing attitudes of those in schools with and without a specialist centre. In addition to school type, it also is important to explore the impact of personal exposure, so the amount of time a person spends with autistic people. Contact has been found to challenge negative attitudes, disconfirm stereotypes and promote cross-group friendships. Previous studies have shown that children in school settings providing contact with autistic peers showed greater knowledge and more positive attitudes towards autistic peers than children in schools with no contact. Finally, the role of pupils' sense of school belongingness was also explored. So this exists when members of the school community feel accepted and share positive and consistent relationships. Carol Goodnow in 1993 defined school belongingness as the extent to which students feel personally accepted, respected, included and supported by others in the school environment. So this provides a proxy measure for school inclusivity. So this was a field study based on real school environments with established group norms. The study was conducted in school classrooms, with each class consisting of approximately 30 pupils. The questionnaires were paper-based and completed under controlled conditions. It compared data from a baseline taken at the beginning of year 7 when they were 11 to 12 years old, and a follow-up in year 10 when they were 14 to 15 years old. And the study was a factorial design, with the between subject factors being school setting, so schools with and without a specialist centre, personal exposure to autism, the target of bullying in a vignette depicting a bullying scenario, so either with an autistic target of bullying or a neurotypical target of bullying, and the type of violation in the vignette, so either verbal bullying or social exclusion. So questionnaires included one of 4 different vignettes depicting a story about a bullying incident, and participants were allocated quasi-randomly to one of the 4 vignettes. So whilst previous studies have asked participants to imagine what the response of the victim or the perpetrator would be, in this study participants were asked to imagine themselves watching the scene taking place as a bystander, since bullying research shows that this is the most likely role for the majority of school children. So characters within the vignettes were the same gender as the participant. In addition, at follow-up, we ran 2 multiple regression analyses, exploring whether sense of school belonging and personal exposure could predict cognitive attitudes towards autism and judgments towards the bullying of an autistic person. So participants were recruited from 4 mainstream secondary schools, 2 with specialist centres and 2 schools without. And at baseline, there were 586 non-autistic participants, and then 302 at follow-up that could be matched to the baseline questionnaires. And this study was designed 7 years ago, at a time when there was lower social understanding of sex and gender, and binary classification of gender was still somewhat the norm. However, I would like to stress that I'm aware of this limitation in the study, and that I am gender inclusive, and ensure that my current research reflects this, but also stress that gender was not a variable under scrutiny in this study. So participants for the regression analysis were those recruited at the follow-up, and included 542 non-autistic young people aged 14 to 15 years. So after providing demographic information, participants indicated their judgments in response to the bullying scenario. And this measure was developed for this study in line with similar previous studies, which required pupils to indicate their agreement on Likert scales ranging from not at all to extremely. So it consisted of 8 items related to judgments about what happened to the target. So these included 4 pro-social judgments, for example, how much do you think what happened was mean or bullying, and 4 antisocial judgments, such as how much do you think what happened was funny. So antisocial judgments were reverse coded, resulting in a scale of pro-social judgments towards bullying. Attitudes to autism was measured using the adjectives checklist, and this was used to measure cognitive attitudes towards autistic people. So participants were asked to think of a person they knew who is autistic, and to circle words from a list of 34 adjectives, 17 positive and 17 negative. And the adjectives describe affective feelings, physical appearance, academic behaviour and social behaviour. And they're the kinds of adjectives that they might use if they had to describe this person to their classmates. And personal exposure to autism, this was a measure of the time spent with people they knew to have autism, and was measured on a Likert scale from never to very often. And a median split was used to categorise pupils as either having high or low personal exposure at each time point, and this resulted in 3 categories, either decrease, no change or increase in personal exposure. And finally, sense of school belonging. the psychological sense of school membership scale was used at time 2 only, and this consists of an 18-item scale and measures 5 aspects of an adolescent's school life, including school, other people, students, teachers and self. So looking at the 4 areas of focus, the results showed no main effects or interactions by school setting type, no main effects or interactions by change in personal exposure. However, we did find some significant differences according to the bullying targets and violations, and also predictors of attitudes towards autism and bullying, which I will outline now. So first, looking at the interaction of target and violation. So this revealed a significant interaction, which indicated that for verbal bullying, which is the blue line here, there was a general decrease in prosocial judgments, or put another way, an increase in antisocial judgments between year 7 and year 10. But in particular, we see a greater decrease in prosocial judgments for autistic targets than for non-autistic targets. But the opposite effect was true for social exclusion, which resulted in a decrease in prosocial judgments for non-autistic targets, but an increase for autistic targets. So let's break this down into looking across from time 1 to time 2. So we can see the prosocial judgment scores at time 1 in green, and prosocial judgment scores at time 2 in blue. So first, looking in response to the vignette depicting verbal bullying, we can see that between year 7 and year 10, participants actually decrease their prosocial judgments towards verbal bullying of both neurotypical and autistic targets. And now, looking at the pattern for social exclusion, we can see that while prosocial judgments decrease when the target is neurotypical, they increase when the target is autistic. So this indicates that with age, in contrast to all the other scenarios, participants are less likely to tolerate the social exclusion of an autistic person. So moving on to the cross-sectional analysis at time 2. As previously mentioned, we ran 2 multiple regression analyses, exploring whether sense of school belongingness and personal exposure can predict cognitive attitudes towards autism and prosocial judgments towards bullying of an autistic person. So the first multiple regression looking at predictors of cognitive attitudes towards autism. First checks were made to ensure that there were no violation of the assumptions of multiple regression. An R-squared of 0.07 was found, and this means that 7% of the variation in cognitive attitudes towards autism can be explained by this model, which included sense of school belongingness and personal exposure. And this is reflected by the fairly low correlations between cognitive attitudes and sense of school belongingness of 0.21 and between cognitive attitudes and personal exposure of 0.16. However, the model does show that both variables make a unique and statistically significant contribution to the prediction of cognitive attitudes towards autism scores. And standard coefficients show that sense of school belongingness had the largest beta value with a beta coefficient of 0.20, whereas personal exposure had a beta coefficient of 0.15. So this means that sense of school belonging makes a strongly unique contribution to explaining cognitive attitudes to autism. And looking at the partial plot for sense of school belongingness, we can see that there's some positive linear correlation with an R of 0.21. And we can see here that sense of school belongingness provides a unique contribution of 4%, whereas personal exposure only provided a unique contribution of 2%. And moving on to predictors of prosocial judgments towards bullying of an autistic person. Again, we find no violation of assumptions, and again an R-squared of 0.07, meaning 7% of the variation in prosocial judgments can be explained by this model. And this is again reflecting the fairly low correlations. However, the model shows that only sense of school belongingness makes a unique and statistically significant contribution to the prediction of prosocial judgments towards bullying. Standard coefficients show that sense of school belongingness had a beta value of 0.26, meaning that sense of school belongingness makes a unique contribution to explaining prosocial judgments towards the bullying of an autistic person, but that personal exposure does not. Looking at the partial plot for sense of school belongingness, we can see again there's some positive linear correlation with an R of 0.27. And as we can see here, the sense of school belongingness provides a unique contribution of 6.7. So in conclusion, the findings indicated that between Year 7 and Year 10, non-autistic adolescent students increased their prosocial judgments, or put another way, decreased their tolerance of the social exclusion of autistic people. And this effect occurred regardless of school type or level of personal exposure. And this was particularly interesting since all other bullying scenarios resulted in more antisocial responses with age. Studies show verbal bullying to be the most common form of bullying, and it may be that this is accepted as a social norm and so more tolerated in order to preserve group functioning and social conventions. And this is something that was discussed by Adam Rutland and Melanie Killen in their writings on morality, prejudice and group identity in children. And they use social domain theory to explain how with age, children prioritise reasons they give, either moral or social conventional, when making decisions about social transgressions. For example, social exclusion is sometimes perceived as morally wrong, but at other times is considered legitimate to protect the effective functioning of a social group. So perhaps this might, to some extent, explain the difference in findings between social exclusion of a non-autistic person compared to an autistic person. And finally, we conclude that sense of school belongingness was more influential than personal exposure for change in cognitive attitudes towards autism and bullying. And studies have emphasised that sense of school belongingness is achieved through quality of social relations, so with school staff and with pupils, as well as perceived inclusiveness of the school ethos. And other studies have shown that teachers in inclusive schools tend to have a greater understanding of special educational needs, and so are better equipped to meet the specific social and academic needs, contributing to the development of a strong sense of school belongingness. However, the smaller influence of personal contact seems to be at odds with Allport's contact hypothesis. However, one limitation of the current study is the relatively crude measure of personal contact. Future research should seek a more detailed and nuanced measurement that includes both quality and quantity of contact. And further research could also be strengthened by considering inclusion of further predictors of attitude, such as age, with the inclusion of a wider age range, and other factors in light of recent research findings. For example, young people's knowledge of autism is found to be a predictor by Alana Shand and colleagues, and Ailey Cage too, and also Ailey Cage and colleagues who found dehumanisation to be a predictor of attitudes to autism. So this would be an important factor to include in future models as well. So the take-home message from this study is that inclusive school environments where all pupils have a sense of school belongingness are essential to reduce tolerance of bullying and increase positive attitudes towards autism. So a few thank yous again to my funders for their generous sponsorship, to colleagues at the University of Surrey and Goldsmiths for their support throughout this PhD study. Massive thanks to the wonderful team of research assistants who made it possible to collect data face-to-face in classrooms from such a large sample and across a 3-year period. And I owe huge gratitude, of course, to the teachers who welcomed us into their schools and, of course, the many children who participated. And last but not least, thank you very much for listening.